Joseph, thanks for being here. I think we'd all agree we are kind of living in a somewhat surprising world where big leader culture is back. And I think that makes your book sort of doubly interesting because we're trying to figure out not only what policies these people might adopt, but where did they come from? How did they get to be who they are? What was their formative experience like? So in Joseph's really wonderful book, it is a thick book, but God, he's done a lot of amazing research. And strangely, most of it not in China, which maybe he'll talk about. So Joseph, tell us, just for starters, don't go on too long, who was this guy, Xi Zhongxun? And then I want to ask you why we should care about him. But let's start with the first. Give us a rough sketch of this sort of amazing man's life and hardships.
Well, first of all, let me thank the Asia Society for bringing me here. And I'm looking forward to all of your questions and comments. And thanks for letting me start by telling you who he was, starting with the basics so you have a general sense of what his life was like. He was born in 1913, 2 years after the end of the Qing dynasty in Shanxi province. It was an interesting place to grow up because Qin Shi Huang had forged the first unified Chinese state close to the village where he grew up, and the dynasties for millennia had ruled from Xi'an, but by the time Xi Zhongxun was born, it had suffered many years of banditry and war and famine. So it was a very dramatic place, right? Because on the one hand, you could see the architecture that had been left behind as legacy from the emperors, but everything around it had fallen into war and disarray. He, at 15 years old, committed his first revolutionary act. He was ordered by the party to attempt to assassinate an academic administrator at his school. He failed, although several teachers were poisoned, and he was thrown into prison. And in prison, he joined the party. And when he was released, he couldn't walk because he was sick. His father died apparently because of the stress of what his son had just experienced. And to remotivate himself, he reads novels, actually. He's not reading Marxism-Leninism. So his initial attraction isn't so much ideological, but looking to how a novel is presenting the meaning of a life of struggle and sacrifice. Even.
A little bit like Mao.
So it's interesting too, like both Xi Zhongxun and Mao Zedong were people who saw themselves as practical individuals. They didn't give up on the idea that you needed to have a political worldview, that you needed to have a bigger perspective. But for Xi Zhongxun, his education ended at 15 years old. And then in 1935, he's arrested again. He's put in prison again, this time not by the nationalists, but by fellow communists. And until the end of his life, he said that he believed that he was going to be buried alive. In the last years of the Civil War and the early years of the People's Republic of China, he's in charge of something called the Northwest Bureau, which covers a vast expanse of China, the entire Northwest, including Xinjiang, Gansu, Qinghai, Shanxi, and other areas. So he's tasked with figuring out how to incorporate Uyghurs, Tibetans, Hui, many ethnic minorities, and that begins a long career in ethnic politics. He's brought to the capital. His first job is as Minister of Propaganda. There's ideology again. And then in 1962, he's purged from the leadership because of a novel, which for complicated reasons we can discuss, Mao interprets as a manifestation of class struggle. He spends 16 years in the political wilderness.
More than wilderness.
Well, incarceration, struggle sessions, exile. And then when he goes back to work, it's to an interesting place. It's to Guangdong, where the failure of the revolution is more obvious maybe than anywhere else in the country, because all you need to do is look across the border into Hong Kong and see how this capitalist colony has really accelerated its development. And he is told by the leadership to figure out how to stop tens of thousands of people from fleeing the socialist mainland for capitalist Hong Kong. Then he goes to Beijing to work on the secretariat, which is sort of the brain of the party. His direct superior is a man named Hu Yaobang. They're very close associates. They become sort of comrades in arms. And Hu Yaobang, of course, is purged in 1987. Xi Zhongxun was deeply upset by that. And he was also deeply upset in 1989 at the June 4 crackdown. But in both 87 and 89, he still put the party's interests first. And he decided to go along with Deng's decision. And it weighed on him very heavily. In 1990, he has an altercation with the premier at a meeting of the National People's Congress. He sleeps on the couch. He's acting very strangely. And according to these wonderful diaries that are available at Hoover, written by Li Rui, who was a former secretary to Mao Zedong, these actions were the result, quote, of years of pent-up frustrations. And he spends his last years in Shenzhen sort of having had a falling out with the central leadership.
So I think it's fair to say that his life was one punctuated by sort of extreme repudiation and hardship. And oddly, the repudiation and the hardship was delivered to him by the very apparat to which he declared his utter fealty and never really wavered from that, did he?
So I think the book at heart is shaped by this question of why he remained so devoted to a party that persecuted him. And in fact, on one occasion, he bragged that Deng Xiaoping had been purged by the party 3 times and he had been purged 5 times. And I think that when you hear that, it might suggest that he's complaining, but actually he's credentialing, because he's manipulating the politics of suffering to say something very interesting, which is that when the party subjected him to these humiliations, to these purges, his reaction wasn't that the party is wrong. It was that there's something wrong with me, and that to win the party's trust again, I need to work even harder. And that, by the way, by showing that his ideals were not shaken, he has sort of a prestige and status that other people do not. So
More suffering.
So it's interesting. In 1935, he was incarcerated by the communists, and then during the Cultural Revolution, he was incarcerated by the communists. And he had physical wounds from both of those experiences, and he showed them to people when they complained as a way of saying, "I bet you don't have anything like this," right? And so it's this idea that that we don't just see in Xi Zhongxun, but we see in many other people in the party. I'm not just saying it's him alone. That counterintuitively, desperation leads to further dedication and not alienation, at least for him.
So Joseph, let me ask you a question that's always puzzled me. I mean, there are many questions that your book and other books raise, and that's the following. Usually we think of Chinese culture as not being sort of extremely deeply imbued with sort of Freudian principles and understandings. And yet, you've just told us, and I think you're absolutely right, that there is some psychological mechanism within the party that whereby abuse leads to greater loyalty. And I'm wondering how you analyze that or explain it. Is it because people think that they can correct themselves, that the party leaves that open through the idea of thought reform and sort of purging yourself of your class background or your bourgeois ideas? How do you analyze that odd sort of principle of loyalty?
Communism is many things, but one of the things it is a source of meaning and purpose for the people who are members of this organization. So as I described to you, Xi Zhongxun was growing up in a milieu where the youth were wondering whether the nation would survive Western encroachment, would survive the bandits. They were witnessing violence everywhere. The
Japanese occupation.
And so finally you're given this message that if you join this party, you can be a participant in this grand adventure of returning China to its rightful place in the world. And it's this idea that to achieve this Herculean task, you need to put something bigger than yourself ahead of your own individualism. And that is something that they consciously pursued, but also was emotionally traumatic to achieve. Because on the one hand, even if you recognize that this is something that you want to happen, the party talks about a constant war between the needs of the organization and individualism. And so Xi Zhongxun throughout his life would talk about individualism as a virus that could never be cured, and that even the tiniest bit in a very a large person could very rapidly take over. And so you needed to, there was no equilibrium, there was no stasis. And in fact, the better you were doing, the more likely you would be self-confident, and counterintuitively, the more vulnerable you would be to making mistakes because you were letting your eye off the ball and you weren't being vigilant enough. So but also think of how much they sacrificed for the cause, right? Sacrificing not just by risking your life against the nationalists, not just watching your friends get killed, not just watching the party make mistakes and hurting you and your friends, and finally, despite all odds, the party wins. To reject the party would mean rejecting yourself. I mean, it's not even so much that it was a choice, because it was beyond a choice. It was inconceivable that the party would do something and push you away from it, because it was the deepest source of meaning in your life. So I think maybe for some people it sounds ridiculous or bizarre or silly, but for someone who is part of that milieu, I think we can have empathy and understand it even if we don't forgive it. And even as we recognize that because so many people thought this way, it led often to quite tragic implications for the nation as a whole.
And yet, as far as I've been able to discover, there is no text on how to do this. It just sort of, there's an almost an autonomic element to this within the party to know how to control people, keep loyalty. Have you discovered anybody, whether it's in literature or in party documents or party history, where they sort of say, here's how we do it. You should study this. I mean,
I think they figured it out in Yan'an around 1942, 1943. So why do I say that? So Yan'an was the base area, right? It was the communist capital during the war against Japan and during the Civil War. And so the puzzle for Mao, right, is how you take this disparate band of communists who had a lot of prestige and status because the battles they had fought and have their own ways of thinking about the world. And then you also have these very young people who come from often urban areas, who are a little arrogant, a little entitled, who have this hero complex of solving the nation, and you turn them into a weapon. And, this isn't value-laden language that I'm applying. From the diaries, we know that they wanted to become screws, right? They wanted to become tools.
like Lei Feng.
And that turning into that is excruciating, because you go through struggle sessions, you go through self-criticisms, you have people read your diaries, people circle around you and shout at you, and they doubt you, and sometimes they incarcerate you, and a lot of it is studying, a lot of it is education, a lot of it is reading texts. So ultimately, Mao's solution for the crisis that the nation was finding wasn't enlightenment and democracy and science, but violence, and turning this group of people into a tool that he could use to take over the nation and then transform it.
So what do you think the difference is that when someone turns as Xi Jinping, and we'll get to Xi Jinping, that despite what happened to your family life, you stay loyal, you keep trying to prove yourself all the more you're criticized, and people who say, that's enough, become a dissident and often get crushed, but go that route. What do you think that triggering mechanism is?
So you're asking a rather philosophical question, which is, what kind of suffering leads to dedication and what leads to alienation? And we could spend a lot of time discussing that. And what's interesting, right, is Xi Jinping's own children seem to have drawn different lessons from the meaning of their father's life. One didn't survive the forge. She killed herself during the Cultural Revolution. Another became associated with this group of pro-reform intellectuals and senior cadres in Beijing, and the others made a lot of money. And so when we look at Xi Jinping and people like him and ask, why is he different? Well, one possibility is that there was something about his childhood, maybe the year he was born, or the school he went to, or the mentors he accrued, or there's just something about him, right? And so Xi Jinping, interestingly enough, he admitted that during the Cultural Revolution, he went through a period of doubt. He talked about how it proved to be an illusion and that he had brought these dogmatic ideas to the countryside that had proven farcical. But that after thinking about it, he concluded that still it was the party that was the only thing that could save China. And has said that, because they went through this period of reflection, my ideals and convictions are stronger than anyone who didn't go through that. But then the question becomes, okay, so you want someone to go through that, but how do you make sure they come out with the right answer on the other side? And this gets into a central dilemma, I think, of what Xi Jinping is trying to achieve in China, which is he wants to break 5,000 years of dynastic collapse one after another by baptizing 5,000 years of Chinese traditional culture with self-revolution, through continuous moral education of his father's generation stories and teaching them the meaning of struggle and sacrifice and national mission and rejuvenation. And I think that clarion call is deeply meaningful probably to many Chinese, but to how many and for how long and to which, and whether other Chinese are more interested in living less ardent lives, I think is existential for him. So he says openly, repeatedly, that Xi Jinping, that the imperialists, what they want to do is achieve peaceful evolution. So what's peaceful evolution? Well, peaceful evolution is this idea that the capitalists are too cowardly to use war to destroy the communists. So what they need to do is fight a war without gunpowder, which means winning over China's youth, which in Xi Jinping's mind is not, of course, the second generation, which is him, who were raised by the revolutionaries. It's the third and fourth generation that are China's youth now that are the sort of moment of maximum vulnerability. And so this is something that I think for Xi Jinping is existential. So when you hear this stuff in China about Tangping, meaning laying down, meaning not wanting to join the rat race, or Runxue, meaning the study of how to run away, this isn't just an economic problem or a social problem. For him, it's a question of whether or not the mountains and rivers will stay red for decades and even centuries into the future.
I mean, I think it's very interesting that, that individualism, as you described in this scheme of things, and it's not unique to China. I think this is one aspect, a sort of Leninist model, that where there's one state, one party, one show on the road, and you either get with that program or you're out of it. And life is pretty horrendous if you get out of it. And yet, it is the party itself that keeps pushing people out, and yet they keep coming back. So if we hopscotch now for a moment to his son, and you've described one of his sisters committed suicide, and there's various family experiences. It seems to me that the trauma that has been induced, not just in China, but I would say in Russia and many other countries that experience such revolutions, is pretty incredible. How do you think Xi Jinping is different than his father, or do you take the same sort of analytical framework and apply it to him that you do to the father?
So I think if you want to understand Xi Jinping and you read my book, there are two things to look at in particular. One is the relationship between the father and the son, and what it was like for Xi Jinping to grow up in that home and for someone to watch a father like that. But the other, I think, is to read my book as a history of the Chinese Communist Party in the 20th century, to get a sense for the party that Xi Jinping inherited and the dilemmas that he now faces that his predecessors did as well, to contextualize the approach that he has adopted. So in the question of what Xi Jinping experienced as a young person, well, as I've been talking to you, these generational questions they keep reappearing. And so when Xi Jinping was born in 1953, he was born into a family that was very worried that their offspring would become privileged and spoiled and therefore divorced from the masses and not good inheritors of the revolution. And so the Xi family was known as notoriously disciplinarian, notoriously strict and frugal. And part of that, I think, was Xi Zhongxun was a peasant, and they tend to have strict households. But part of it also was this political background that I just described to you, which is if individualism is something that you need to defeat for the party to survive, the most dangerous vector for that individualism is the family, because it's such a particular kind of relationship, right? And so
a different kind of loyalty.
Right. So then what the family is supposed to be in this kind of system is a microcosm for the party, right? So that the party uses the family as a way of teaching them collectivist values and why they should be loyal to the party, right? And so it was a hard place to grow up, but I'm sure it was also an electric place to grow up, an exciting place to grow up, because the father would be regaling his children with these exciting stories from the revolution. So to be in that kind of household and going to a school where most of your peers are fellow princelings, and then your father to be purged when you're only 9 years old. We can only imagine what that was like. And then when the Cultural Revolution begins, Xi Jinping goes to his teacher and says, how does this kind of thing happen? And it's a very human thing to ask why you witness evil, why you witness suffering. And he is incarcerated in Beijing. In fact, in one interview in the 1980s, he said that it was so terrible he thought he was going to die. And then he's exiled to the countryside, to a particularly poor region for a particularly long time. And he said, nothing could be as hard as that. And it made me tough, really, right? And so to come up with that kind of background, I think that it's a... and then go into the 1980s, and his peers have decided that they want to make up for lost time because of what they went through during the Cultural Revolution, and they want to make money, they want to have fun, they want to go overseas. And Xi Jinping is watching that, and he's worried about it, and he's self-consciously portraying himself as a better answer, an answer that is about going back to the party, because now things are getting better, we should be even more motivated to help the nation and stop another cultural revolution from happening. So he's kind of a story in some ways of the dangers of taking ideology too seriously and the dangers of taking ideology not seriously enough.
At one point in your book, you sort of eschew the notion that you either want to or are getting into any kind of Freudian analysis. And yet I think we can all agree that the father-son relationship, and again, you read literature, it's replete with examples of this, is a really fundamental thing. And I'm wondering how you analyze Xi Jinping's formative teenage years when he was sent off to the countryside, and remember, his father's a counter-revolutionary.
So on one occasion, someone asked Xi Jinping, was your career affected because your father is Xi Zhongxun? And Xi Jinping said, naturally, family background is significant, but in ways that I don't think you expect in my case. Being the son of Xi Zhongxun didn't show me that politics is about banquets and flowers. What it really showed me was the fickleness of human nature and the cow's heads where people were confined during the Cultural Revolution. And that's a very interesting way to put it, right? Because Xi Jinping is someone who definitely benefited from the fact that his father was a prominent leader, but you can also see how he would be very sensitive to claims that he only climbed the ranks because of nepotism. And there's some truth to that, right? Because he said later that compared to other princelings, he suffered more than others because his father was purged in 1962, which was several years before the beginning of the Cultural Revolution, when most of the other senior revolutionaries were targeted. And Xi Jinping had, when he was a sent-down youth, he applied so many times to get into the youth league, so many times into the party, and he was rejected many times and told that you can't because you are the son of a counter-revolutionary. And so that must have been extraordinarily galling. And it also...
Painful.
And painful, and it also rhymes with his own father's legacy, right? Because the father is constantly being told that he's not good enough, constantly being told that his individualism is corrupting him and that he's not a good party member, and then doubles down on his attempts to prove the party wrong. So for Xi Jinping to be told that, you know, he can't be a good party member because of his father, you can see how you would think to yourself, well, I'm going to show you. I'm going to show you what a good party member I can be, right? And so in that sense, it's like, it's not his father benefiting him because of nepotism, although there was nepotism, which we can talk about. But you can see how he would also feel that he was looked down upon because he was the son of his father. And especially also when we get into the 1980s, The princelings were a problematic group because on the one hand you would think that they would be wonderful successors because at least they wouldn't dig up their father's graves. But on the other hand, princelings had often difficult personalities, but also they weren't well liked in society because they were seen as benefiting from nepotism and corruption and that kind of thing.
You know, it seems to me one of the quests that Xi Jinping was on, and I wonder if you feel Xi Jinping might have a version of this too, was to find a middle ground. And, you know, if you read through the biographies, a lot of these party leaders, they're kind of searching for some way to have it both ways, to be loyal in the party, but also stay true to whether it's morality, individualism, their love of their families, their parents, their wives, whatever. And yet that middle ground just is so elusive.
You're speaking to a central dilemma that's been with the party from the very beginning. So there's this idea of partyness, 党性, right? And then humaneness or humanityness, 人性. And so often they didn't conflict, right? Often you would see that by being a good party member, it's for the good of humanity. So you could tell yourself a story that whatever means you apply because it's for the good of the party, you never need to feel guilty about it. So I think they tried to use that kind of reasoning, but they often felt guilty and ashamed when they were forced to do things they knew were wrong and when they witnessed the tragic implications of the policies that they executed. And so, interestingly, even Xi Zhongxun, on one occasion, someone saw him weeping because he felt so bad about what had happened to his family because of him during the Cultural Revolution. And so there's this other problem to keep in mind, right, to illustrate what it is you're getting at, which is in the party, it's normal to have differences of opinion, although I don't want to overstate them because the differences are relative because they're all party members. But when you have a dispute, it's never clear to someone whether it's just a reasonable difference in tactics or a competition between two political lines. And that one person is engaging in some kind of ideological heresy, right? So what I'm saying is the party, when they were looking at any policy, if they are too ambitious, if they're too zealous and they go too far, it can blow up in their face. But if they are too cautious and they don't move quickly enough, and nothing is changing, and they're not achieving their goals quickly enough, that's also a problem. And so for someone trying to figure out which direction to go in, it's safer to go in the leftist direction, the more revolutionary direction. But on the other hand, you also don't want to make such a hash of things that you're punished for it. And so whether you're on the left or you're on the right, it's an inherently subjective question. And people who don't like you accuse you with those labels when they want to hurt you. But ultimately, the person who decides whether a label is applied and which label is Mao Zedong or Deng Xiaoping because they're in charge. They get to decide whether someone is going to be characterized in that way. And Mao, more than anyone, was someone who would take differences of opinion and see them as manifestations of something deeper, as symptoms of a bigger problem, and which for him he constantly saw as class struggle. So the other thing too to keep in mind is, yeah, you might have your own views, but that's not your center of gravity. Your center of gravity is understanding what Mao wants. It's understanding what Deng wants and doing a better job than anyone else bringing it to them. And making sure that somebody doesn't get you in trouble by saying that you're not on board and that you don't understand what Mao or Deng wants.
So it's very outer directed. And I'm kind of wondering, I mean, even in Confucianism, there was this notion of self-cultivation, 修身, things like that. So what happens to that instinct in this world that you're documenting for us of just human beings wanting to be human and wanting to have a life and care for their children? And how does that, what happens?
So I think in some ways this, like how you raise your family, the way I've been describing it, I think that you find meaning in that strictness and you find meaning in that moral education because you believe that this is to the benefit of your children because it makes them better communists. So in some ways I think that they can kind of square that circle, but not always. And when that happens, people put the party's interests first. Sometimes they think that, you know, there's something wrong with them and that's why they're getting criticized. And because it's inconceivable to reject the party ultimately. And so if you have a different opinion, when you speak that opinion, how you characterize that opinion, figuring out when it's safe to make that to voice that opinion, all of those are very dangerous, right? And so one of the other things that emerges constantly in my book is it's not clear where the red lines are for these people, right? And so in the 1980s, there was a recognition that strongman leadership had been a disaster. There was a recognition that a strongman leader like Mao should be avoided. And Deng pretended that he wasn't like a Mao, and he didn't want people to think he was a Mao. But nevertheless, just like Mao, he was jealous of power and paranoid and interpreted differences of opinion when people weren't reading him right is symptomatic of a big problem, and that's why he got rid of so many different successors, right? And that's why I think the story of Xi Zhongxun is so interesting, is he witnessed both during the Mao years and during the Deng years how nobody could stop these leaders, even when they made choices that were so damaging to the party and to the Chinese people.
I mean, I think you have to recognize that, as I recall from your book, during the campaign against landlords, land reform in the early 50s, where 1 million, 2 million landlords were executed. I mean, Xi Jinping was constantly looking for isn't there some more temperate way to do this?
Well, there's different ways to look at this, right? One is all their goals were ultimately the same. So whether or not you think it's meaningful for someone to look at a less bloody land reform, still the big picture is that land reform is inherently bloody, right? And that on certain policies, Xi Jinping was just as bloody as others. So if we look at the Yan'an rectification that I just mentioned a moment ago, in the area of the base camp that he was leader, it went off the rails in a very dramatic fashion. And in fact, a man named Kang Sheng, and for those of you who aren't Chinese experts, he's seen as a real radical, like a real conspiratorial individual, sort of like the Chinese Beria, for those of you who've seen The Death of Stalin. He was impressed by how radical Xi Jinping was, how successful Xi Jinping was at finding spies, and he used this sort of mass campaign to mobilize regular people to target a school, and particularly young women. And of course, none of them were spies, and they were all rehabilitated. So, on certain occasions, Xi Jinping was quite radical as well, and also, this idea that he was uniquely liberal or uniquely humane. He could change his mind on things. Like, he was someone whose views could evolve, and that he could come across as a conservative in some areas and more liberal in other areas. And in the 1980s, for an example, he was instrumental in this new approach in ethnic politics, where because the Cultural Revolution had been such a disaster for the Han's relations with ethnic minorities, when any manifestation of an ethnic characteristic was seen as a problem of class struggle, Xi Jinping spent most of his time on the United Front, about 70% of his time, which included Tibet and Xinjiang and Inner Mongolia. And he said, look, we need to take a step back, and we need to think about economic modernization. We need to think about addressing grievances. We need to think about making alliances with powerful interlocutors who have respect in their own communities. We need to think about bringing religion out into the open so it can be better controlled. And so these are all forms of, from the very beginning, either the dynasties or the party, mechanisms of dominance. But when people started to going to church too much, and when people started to go to mosques and temples too much, his immediate reaction was to take a step back and increase more control. And part of that was to protect the broader policy agenda that he had introduced. But you can see that he was still someone with a phobia of chaos, and someone who didn't mobilize dissidents, but someone who wanted them to shut up. And that he wanted to do something about them too, but couldn't figure out how to do it in a way that still protected the broader goals of reform and opening, because it was an inherently difficult problem. So it wasn't so much left versus right, but the inherent dilemma of how you try to achieve two things at once that make sense in theory, but in practice are very hard.
I mean, it's interesting that in your book, I think it's fair to say that Xi Jinping and even Xi Jinping come out as almost, and at one point you say this, I think at the end of your book, they're in a kind of Faustian wager. But they're not terrible people. They're struggling to find some equipoise within these two kind of absolutely antagonistic contradictions. And of course, it can't be resolved. But what it seems to me looks a lot less rosy is the party itself. That you feel your characters are stuck in a play, struggling to find some way to keep themselves human, and yet the revolution goes on, and they become its victims, and they try to get reborn. Would you say that's a fair assessment?
So one of the themes of the book is to provide an empathetic picture of the people in it, to facilitate other people making their own judgments about its characters. And so that's not to say I wrote the book to justify what they do or to forgive them, but for people to understand the full meaning of the choices that they made. And so I think it's not surprising to people that the party has coercive power in the sense of organization and violence. But really, one of the most striking themes from my book is how it also had an emotional power, right? And so the people in the book, sometimes they're remarkably self-reflective. Sometimes they're remarkably blunt about the party's challenges and mistakes, but they can't think their way beyond a certain box, right? And so the Faustian bargain, as you've described, right? It's this idea that ultimately, for China to survive, we need to have an organization that can command extraordinary levels of obedience, and that this inevitably will be an imperfect organization, but that any other conceivable scenario is unmistakably worse. So if you have that kind of view, then everything that they do sort of makes sense. But then you also understand the full implications of that worldview, which are the tragedies that also accompany this history.
So before we open it to you all for questions, let me ask you one final one. How do you think Xi Jinping looks back on his own past and family?
You know, one possibility is that he thinks that he made the right choice, because as grueling as those choices were, as horrific as his family's experiences had been, look at China now. So it's a utilitarian worldview of meaningful sacrifices, and it's brought China to a place where it is either a superpower or a near superpower. Xi Jinping was born in 1953 and witnessed a great leap forward, the Cultural Revolution, and look at them now. So in that sense, I'm sure that Xi Jinping knows that people take how others understood his father and use these stories about his father as a weapon against him. But I think the way Xi Jinping probably thinks about it is that we, the Communist Party, succeed because we can do two things at the same time, which is respect legacy, respect tradition, to not forget our initial motivation, but also innovate and change and recognize when problems emerge and address them as they do. So in that sense, moving in a new direction isn't a rejection of his father, but just being loyal to him in another way. And that's partly my own interpretation, but I think also something he said explicitly. In fact, in the 1980s, Xi Jinping's very first article in People's Daily was about how to respect elders, but also innovate at the same time. So I think that in that sense, he probably believes that the true way of being loyal to his father is by showing that the Xi family is just as good as anyone else. And his ambition, as I've described it, which is breathless in some ways, is rooted partly in that idea, but also this idea that he is the inheritor of these, millennia of Chinese history, and he wants to preserve it in a Chinese level, Chinese kind of modernization, and defeat these attempts by the West to turn China into something that's no longer Chinese and just independent of their sort of imperialist plots.
And would you say that sort of behind all this is the impetus to make China great again, this sense of greatness lost that needs to be restored, and then that kind of justifies lots of things that might not be justifiable in another social or political system.
So you can imagine other ways of organizing Chinese society, right? And many people who went through the exact same things as Xi Jinping drew lessons that are diametrically opposed, because they looked at the Cultural Revolution and they decided that for China to not fall back into situations reminiscent of the darker periods of its history, that the answer is democracy, or at least constitutionalism, and finding ways of avoiding another strongman, of finding ways of establishing rule of law. And for them to stop another generation of Red Guards ransacking homes and beating people up, you need to avoid a strong leader. You need to avoid an unrestrained party. You need to be able to find a way of
Collective leadership.
Right, right. But for Xi Jinping, he drew a different conclusion, which is this idea of self-revolution, which he, it's an idea of not a May 4th Enlightenment story. It's a story of national sacrifice and mission, and eating bitterness, and pursuing greatness through power.
Do you think China has the edge over America in its capacity that it's learned to eat lots of bitterness?
So two things about that. Xi Jinping says that the United States is a capitalist society, which is why it's inherently inferior. I mean, he's open about his view on this, and that where does this inferiority come from? Well, in a capitalist society, capital dominates. And what that means is you have material wealth, but spiritual poverty. And that contradictions in society become worse and worse, and that other countries lose faith in you, and that your foreign policy becomes increasingly gambler-esque and erratic, as opposed to China, where the party, in his mind, represents all of society and has a meaningful message, and has a good message and a popular message, which is that China deserves to be great again, and that he sees this as a spiritual civilization, communism as a source of purpose and meaning. Now, that's a dilemma, though, because he wants to do two things at once. He wants people to learn to eat bitterness. He wants the third and fourth generation to go on the merry-go-round again and believe in self-revolution. But I'm also convinced he's not so foolish to think that you can't have security without economic growth, and that you can't have economic growth without security. And so how you balance those two becomes really hard. And this is the story that his father witnessed for decades. And so how he balances those in the future will be very interesting to watch. And we've seen that over the last few months, he's been talking a lot more about the economy, as opposed to a couple of years before that when the wolf warriors were barking and there was all this stuff about common prosperity and eating bitterness and that kind of thing. So for Xi Jinping, in the sense of the tariff war, I believe he thinks he has a relative advantage because of the nature of the system's competition. But I also think that he finds economic dislocations to be not useful, because he's also someone who's very worried about social instability, and he is openly admitted on a number of occasions that there is this challenge of butterfly effect, black swan, gray rhino, which is essentially, problems coming from out of nowhere. He says that it's easy for small challenges to become big challenges, and social and economic problems to become political problems. And one way you have those problems is if you can't export as much as you thought you could, right? So again, he's a politician, and one of the things my book tries to do is say that even members of the Chinese Communist Party can't be essentialized into one particular view, but what the history can do for us, at least, is to help us understand the situations in which they find themselves and forecast the different ways that they might approach them, and to give us an analytical lens or an interpretive approach, so that with the small evidence that we do have, we can question assumptions and think about hypotheses and try to get at least closer to the possibilities that might emerge, even if we can't predict the future.
Know what to expect as best we can. Okay, let's open it up to you all now. I ask you to state your name, tell us who you are, and ladies and gentlemen, brevity, please, in your questions. So let's start right here. Yeah, and wait for the mic.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Ruth Stevens, and I'm an adjunct professor of marketing at NYU Stern. A lot of commentators recently have been observing the breakup between Donald Trump and Elon Musk, and commenting that their fathers were harsh with them, and that's why they ended up as adults with those personalities. Do you see any parallels in the Xi father-son relationship?
Having eschewed Freudian analysis, Joseph, please.
Yeah, no, so when you look at the history of Russia watching and China watching within the United States, you often have a habit where people say, I can explain this nation's trajectory or what they're going to do because of this. And then they say something like ideology, or they say something like psychology. And so we saw historians in the 50s and 60s say that the terror happened in the Soviet Union because Stalin was beat up by his father when he was a child. Now, I'm saying that in a way to illustrate why psychology and history are different disciplines. And there's no psychologist I've ever met who would try to make a judgment on Trump without meeting him in person. And I'm not even a psychologist, right? Nevertheless, when I wrote my book, one of its purposes was to help people understand what it was like for him to grow up in that party and to show that different personalities exist even in a monolithic organization like the Chinese Communist Party. So you can draw your own judgments about what that childhood means for who Xi Jinping is today. But I will say that in personality, Xi Jinping and Donald Trump are quite different. Because Xi Jinping is cucumber water, as in cold as cucumber water. He has remarkable self-control. He has remarkable ability to keep his cards close to his chest. So when you're coming up in a system like the Chinese Communist Party, it socializes you to be really, really, really careful. But even in that spectrum, Xi Jinping stood out, right? And you could say that maybe he became that kind of person because his father was quite excitable and volatile, but also he saw his father punished, and he saw the fickleness of human nature, right? So, it's interesting to wonder whether Xi Jinping will change and whether he'll become more hubristic and ambitious and dangerous as we move into the future. I don't really have an answer to that question, but again, when you look at family, one thing you can say is they became this person because of how their parents treated them, but you can also say that it's interesting this person became this person even though they had a similar background. In some ways, that's also revealing, right? When people have similar backgrounds but emerge differently. So again, I said the psychological thing, you have to include that, but it has to be put into something that's more holistic, right? So when I would try to guess what Xi Jinping would do in a particular situation, his personality would be part of that analysis. But the concrete nature of any particular challenge that he faces also needs to be part of that equation.
I have to say, having been on 2 presidential trips and watched Xi Jinping up close for a number of days, I've rarely seen a human being who evinces less of a flicker of whatever it is that is going on inside him in terms of response to the situation. It's quite extraordinary, his level of discipline and control. Okay, next question. Let's take back here.
Hi, my name is Anish. My question was, especially in light of his children's rather intentional, strict and frugal upbringing, how do you think Xi Jinping's father would have viewed the amassing of hundreds of millions, sometimes even billions of dollars in private wealth by the princeling class and the friends and family network of the princeling class following the liberalization policies that he himself intentionally led with Shenzhen and Guangdong province? Would that have been something that he sort of naturally expected as an unfortunate consequence of his policies, or would that be some sort of worst nightmare scenario that he hoped would have never have happened?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I'm not sure what his views of princelings were in the 90s, and he died in 2002, and it was after that that they really started making a lot of money. But I can tell you something about his views of princelings in the 1980s, which I think is useful as we think about your question. So many people were great fans of Xi Zhongxun, but they saw one black mark on his career because of the nepotism that he showed his son. And there's different, we can wonder why that was the case, right? One possibility that one person who worked in the organization department in the 1980s and met Xi Jinping told me was that maybe Xi Jinping just loved his son a lot. Like even the best people really love their kids, right? So, and also we know that he felt guilty about what had happened to his son because of him, and so maybe this was a way of making up for that. But there's two other pieces of context here that are remarkable. One is in commemorative articles about their father, the other children all complain that Xi Zhongxun actively undermined their careers. Now, I don't know how true that is, and at least Cao Cao seems to have benefited from nepotism as well. That's his older sister. But it would be interesting if that's the case, and then also makes it even more curious as to why Xi Jinping was special. And so Xi Zhongxun was a huge fan of his son, right? He's the two things that most stood out to him apparently. One was that Xi Jinping was tough. So all this stuff about Xi Zhongxun being good and Xi Jinping being mean. Well, his own father really liked the fact that he was tough, and in fact, the father said to Xi Jinping's younger sibling, Jinping was in Shanxi. That is just about as hard of a place as you can go. He's walking a different path than you. And the other was that Xi Jinping was good at explaining difficult ideological concepts simply to people so that they could understand, right? But Xi Jinping was also unique from other princelings because the first generation of Red Guards during the Cultural Revolution, many of them were princelings, and they were notorious for smashing and beating and kidnapping and that kind of thing. And Xi Jinping apparently wasn't involved in that kind of stuff. At least I haven't seen evidence of that case. And then in the 1980s, Xi Jinping makes this choice to go work at the grassroots, to go work in the countryside. And this guy from the organization department I spoke to said that was actually a somewhat unique choice and a somewhat special choice, and showed that he didn't want people to think that he was jumping up the ranks because of who his father was. And in the Li Rui diary, so Li Rui, as I said, he worked in the organization department. He ran the Youth Cadre Bureau in the 80s, and they had conversations with each other during which Xi Zhongxun expressed real concern about the princelings as a group, saying that they were behaving in ways that was damaging to the party because they were engaging in nepotism and corruption. And so for Xi Zhongxun, he was someone who was flexible, someone who was practical, but he was also someone who took ideals and conviction very seriously, right? And if you were looking to who your most likely group of successors might be and they're acting materialistic, well, that's the opposite of being idealistic, right? And so he was someone who was aware of how the princelings could prove to be a sort of difficult issue for the party to manage.
Okay, next question. Yes, right here in the aisle.
Right. Hi, my name is Peter Bernstein. I'm just wondering how, after you've so closely studied Xi and his father and other party leaders, you think American policymakers get China wrong in their understanding of what's going on in China.
And maybe Peter, who he is. Yeah.
So it would be so much fun to say that, wow, people in the West, they just don't get China. They really should get their act together. One of the most striking findings from the research I've done in the party is how people at the very apex of the system also have no clue what's going on. So let me give you an example. Li Rui, this name keeps coming up, right? So Li Rui, as I said, he was a very high-ranking figure. He knew Xi Zhongxun, and then he was the sort of informal leader of this group of pro-reform intellectuals and senior cadres in Beijing. And we have his diaries at the Hoover archive, right? And so Xi Jinping comes to power in 2012, and most of them are very optimistic about Xi Jinping because of who they understood his father to be. And gradually, Xi Jinping starts doing things that disappoint them, that surprise them. And it gets to the point where Li Rui is on his deathbed in 2018, and he says to his daughter and one of the sons of Hu Yaobang, I have no idea why Xi Jinping turned out to be the way that he is. And his deathbed request of them was to figure it out. Now, Li Rui, this guy was no joker, folks. Like, this was a smart person. He's been around the block, you know, so to speak. And for him to be surprised, like if Li Rui is getting it wrong, it's not surprising that people in the West are getting him wrong, right? And so we can ask why he got him wrong. We can ask whether Xi Jinping was Xi Jinping in 2012 or whether he became Xi Jinping as time went by. You know, Li Rui said something interesting about Jiang Zemin. He said, you know, Jiang Zemin used to be really courteous of me before he became the top leader, but then he completely changed. And he kind of said it in a way that implied he was also talking about Xi Jinping. And Xi Zhongxun, by the way, I have a quote from him in the book. He said to someone privately that power corrupts. He was talking about Deng Xiaoping, right? He thought Deng Xiaoping was an autocrat and a bully, right? And he thinks that the position kind of made Deng Xiaoping into that, right? So in that sense, it's hard, right? It's really hard. So I think maybe one way to answer your question is that in the West, we do make mistakes that are less common for people who don't understand the system because they're in the system. We tend to think in terms of like these openly warring factions within the party. And we tend to essentialize ideology and say that much of who Xi Jinping is because he's a Marxist. But what I try to do with my book is to show the sprawl, for lack of a better word, which is that these outcomes are so contingent and based on so many different things that are hard to understand that humility actually is one of the big lessons. But at the same time, when you read my book, the same things keep happening over and over again. Right? And so those continuities are also very useful for understanding the system. So I think that at the very least what we can do is, I said in an earlier question, is to interrogate what our assumptions are. And one of the best ways of doing that is looking to history and not to take our own Western perspectives of how politics works, which is often as a system of exchange, of popularity, and realize that in the CCP context is very different, where it's power flows down, and people use force and coercion in a way that's unfamiliar, I think, to people in the West. So,
Yes.
Particularly given the recent...
Tell us who you are.
Bob Hormats, former government official, and I had the opportunity on numerous occasions to meet with Xi Jinping over the years. And I'm very interested in how he evaluates Trump, because so much in many of our negotiations, I mean, to negotiate a trade deal in 2 days is preposterous. It cannot be done. Having been deputy USTR, we've negotiated with the Chinese for years, and they come and they go, and issues are very elusive to even understand, much less resolve. So I'm wondering if you could give a comment. And the Chinese always said when we went there, we negotiate differently from the way you do. You see things differently. What I'm interested now is we're at a period of time when we're trying to at least negotiate a level of, if not normalcy, which I think is probably wishing for the impossible. But how do you bring the relationship back to a more rational, more pragmatic, I guess, kind of level, because it hasn't been in the past? And particularly, how do you think Trump and Xi, or really Xi, sees Trump in the current environment? As a tough negotiator, as a guy he can deal with more easily? I mean, it's clear Putin thinks he can push him around. How does Xi see this as a way of working with the Americans, and does he think he can achieve any progress with him, or how does he evaluate him?
yeah, so naturally I don't have an exact answer to your question, and we can only kind of engage in conjecture, but one of the most surreal moments over the last couple of weeks for me was Taiwanese political talk show picked up on my book. and they talked about my book as if it was an answer to what was going on in the tariff war. And it was this whole thing about how, oh, well, if Xi Jinping had a dad like this, he's so tough, he'll never back down. And I wish that my book was that magical that you could read it and, figure out what's going to happen in the tariff war. But as I keep saying, it's a piece of context. And, what might that context tell us for what's going on? Well, I think that Xi Jinping is somebody who's been around the block. I think he's savvy. I think he understands politics quite well. And I think that, as I mentioned before, he sees real inherent strengths in his own system relative to the American system. And this comment that he made about why capitalism is weaker happened before Trump folded. I'm not quite sure whether they have a good handle on who Trump is and whether they understand Trump. I was surprised by how quickly the tariff numbers went up, and I think that they were too. So it's hard to guess. My own sense is that what Xi Jinping wants is to kind of draw things out for as long as he can. And that if he can reach a deal that basically stabilizes the situation, that he'll be happy with it, but that there's not any real serious consideration within Beijing about going at the more fundamental reasons for why there's so much tension in the U.S. China relationship. So I think that really the situation we're facing as we move forward is that as a society, as a nation, we're trying to figure out how we compete with the Chinese, but not compete in a way that makes it dangerous. And then also to work with the Chinese in ways that we can, but without them taking advantage of the United States. And so that's a difficult balance to walk, and it's hard to guess the direction because Donald Trump is such a transactional person, and because the people on his staff have such different views of these questions. But my own sense is that the Chinese goal is just to not let the situation get any worse than it needs to be. So again, like managing a dilemma without solving a problem, I guess, is the muddle through, so to speak.
Right here.
Hi, I'm Ying Zhu. So it seems to me that Xi Jinping is, he's a believer. He believes, right? He's a believer. He's also a survivor, after those years, right? Witnessing his father and so on and so forth. It takes tremendous amount of resilience in order to survive in this kind of system, which gets back to the question people constantly ask about, what is the party, right? So there is a kind of religious aspect to the party, right? The party has certain doctrine you have to preserve, but on the other hand, the party is not an abstract entity. It continues to evolve depending on at any historical moment who is in power, right? Power entails a lot of power jostling, right? You get to the point. At this, you're at the pinnacle of your power. And so he's a believer, he's a survivor, and so that means he's also nimble in his response. So I think, there's many kind of, there's a historical inevitability, but there's, as you alluded, there's also an accident, right? So nothing is inevitable. So to get back to the question of where this is going in terms of Sino-US relationship, clearly, we don't know, but on the other hand, clearly Xi Jinping and the party, CCP that is, they're a lot more disciplined, more steady and stable when it comes to, dealing with Donald Trump. And so this is the problem we have now, speaking of where this is going, how does it affect America, right? And so actually I do have a question, this is just comment. I do have a question, I'm sorry. So because, whenever you write a biography, right? You rely on diaries and so on and so forth. A lot of these writings, journals are writing for posterity, right? So there's inevitable a level of self-posturing. So to what extent you can maintain this kind of critical distance as you assess these material?
I know there's a question in here someplace, but
it's actually worse than that, because Li Rui, the diary's language is often inherently ambiguous because he was writing for maybe posterity, but he was also writing for himself in a way that he might be able to understand, but for other people, it's not quite all that easy, right? But also, there are tons of rumors in the Li Rui diaries that I know are wrong. So if I thought to myself, wow, this is a primary source, wow, Li Rui was there and talked to all these people, he's writing in his diary, it must be true, that would be a huge mistake. So these diaries are priceless and they're essential. But for people who haven't marinated in a variety of different sources, just go into them and think that they can be easily used, you can make some huge mistakes, right? So it's almost like I feel people need to take a class on the Lee Ray diaries before they're used. But what you're asking is a broader question, which is how do you write a biography about someone like Xi Zhongxun, given the nature of the evidence that's available? And it's really hard. And one of the reasons it's hard is to go back to this Lee Ray story, right? One of the first big warnings to him and the others that Xi Jinping was going to be different than they expected was in a speech that he gave about the collapse of the Soviet Union. And what did he say? Well, one of the things he said was that they collapsed because they lost control of their own history. Now, if you are calling on people to suffer for an organization, you need to tell a story about that as a group of people who march from one triumph to another, and that if there's any mistakes, they're not serious mistakes, and they're mistakes of figuring things out, and that still it's the party that is the best way of going about things. But as soon as you start talking about the past in a dark way, well, for Xi Jinping, that's historical nihilism, and that's an existential threat. And this book is about his father, right? So in that sense, it's a real challenge. And the way I think about it is that we can't go to one archive and collect the relevant material and write up a book. It's better not to think in terms of good and bad evidence, but to collect as much evidence as possible and then parse it and use it to put together a mosaic that in some places is better colored in and others is not. And that you can kind of use a mosaic theory where even though no piece of evidence can be sort of treated as the gospel truth, when you put it all together and you have a lot of context, you can learn a lot. So for example, some of the things I used include a lot of primary sources. And so these primary sources I was able to get in a variety of ways. I'm talking about documents or internally circulated books. They're available at American libraries. You could have got them out of Chinese archives for some time before that has become a lot harder over the last few years. There were lots of memoirs and histories and document collections published in Hong Kong and Taiwan outside of mainland censorship. You can do interviews. I did a lot of interviews for the book. But even in the mainland, there was a lot of really exciting material. So there were these party history journals like Yanhuang Chunqiu that were really pushing the envelope and had material on the Cultural Revolution and the Great Leap Forward. But even the actual like party published chronologies and biographies and document collections, they often are dangerous because of what they don't include, but they don't tend to change what is actually in there. Like they don't tend to make things up that people said or to change their words, although that sometimes happens. And so when you look at that and you take a sort of mosaic theory approach, when you read the chronology, it might be boring and anodyne, but when you've been spending 8 or 9 years researching someone's life, you can suddenly put that in a particular context and it's meaningful in ways that compilers might have not have expected to be possible. And I'll conclude with one other thing that I did is, we haven't talked about this, but there are several chapters about communism as a global phenomenon and Xi Jinping's views and relations with foreign leftist revolutionary parties, and he had a special relationship with the Soviet Union. So I made a list of every single time Xi Jinping went to another country or spoke to someone from another country, and then I went to their archives and got the documents. So I went to the Italian Communist Party archives, the French Communist Party archives, the Russian archives, the Serbian archives, the Romanian archives. He visited the United States, so I got information from him about him from the American archives. He knew the Dalai Lama. It took me 6 years to get an interview with the Dalai Lama, but it happened. But I also was able to get from Dharamsala the verbatim Tibetan language transcripts of the negotiations between the Dalai Lama's emissaries and Xi Zhongxun in the 1980s, when it looked briefly possible like the Dalai Lama might return to Tibet. And so all of these are imperfect sources. All of these are not great, but which means that in the future, some of you will discover new information, future graduate students will discover new information and tell me that I was wrong. And I will be happy with you because I know that this is an iterative process and there's no final draft of history. The question is whether or not when you do any given draft, there is enough new information that it's meaningful and that you can at least learn enough to give a picture that doesn't draw people into the wrong direction. And I hope I did that with my book, but I know that in some cases I won't have done justice to the people in it.
Let me conclude with one question. How do you think the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party will react upon reading your book?
So I wrote this book for 3 reasons. One is that I think there is an inherent value to telling these lives, especially because so many people lost their lives. And so there's a moral duty to go to the past and put their names out, make their names out and bring them back into the world again. The second is to better understand how authoritarian regimes work, right? Because I think that's a really crucial question for both the United States and China. And the third thing is to facilitate people making their own decisions about what this book means. And so maybe people think that's a cop-out, but in China, history is used as moral education. In fact, it's used for self-revolution, because to defeat this challenge of peaceful evolution, for Xi Jinping, the answer is to help people understand what motivated his father's generation. So understanding what that history is, I think, is something that people should be able to read about in a book.
Well, if I may say by way of conclusion, I think what Joseph has done, he's sort of written a play for us that shows but doesn't tell. And yet the book just screams at you in terms of what you could and should take away from it. So I urge you to have a look. And in fact, we're selling copies out in the lobby. So thank you all for coming. And thank you, Joseph.
Thank you, everybody.